The sun was sinking slowly behind the wide horizon, painting the sky in soft shades of gold and red. The land was quiet, but the silence of the plains often carried hidden danger. Far from the safety of her village, a young Comanche girl stood with her hands tied tightly behind her back. Her dark hair, once neatly braided by her mother that morning, now hung loose across her face. She had been taken suddenly with no time to cry out, no chance to warn anyone. Her captors had worked quickly, their rough voices filling the air as they dragged her through the dust and bound her to a tall tree. They did not speak to her kindly, nor did they care for her fear. Their cruel plan was clear. They wanted her to face the night alone, left as prey for the wild beasts that roamed freely after dark. The girl tried to steady her breath, though her heart pounded in her chest. She was young, perhaps no more than 16 summers, but she carried the calm strength of her people. The Comanche were known for courage, for their skill on horseback, for their deep bond with the land. She thought of her father, who had always told her that fear could blind the mind and that a clear spirit could sometimes see a way where none seemed possible. Still, tied to the rough bark of the tree with ropes cutting into her wrists, she could not move even an inch. The ground beneath her feet was dry, and the air already turning colder with the fall of the sun. Her captors, rough men who had quarreled with her tribe, laughed as they walked away. They did not strike her, but their words carried a heavy cruelty. They spoke of wolves and coyotes, of how the wild did not forgive weakness. Then they left her, their horses kicking up dust as they rode off into the growing darkness. The sound of hooves faded and silence returned, broken only by the distant cry of a bird returning to its nest. Alone, the girl leaned her head against the tree and closed her eyes. She whispered a silent prayer, not in words but in the rhythm of her heart, asking the Great Spirit for strength, for courage, for a chance to see her family again. As the light dimmed, the land began to change. The warmth of the day gave way to a chill that wrapped around her shoulders. Shadows stretched long across the ground and the first stars appeared overhead. Night on the plains was a living thing, filled with sound and unseen movement. The girl listened carefully. At first it was only the wind moving through the tall grass. Then she heard something else, a low howl in the distance, faint but clear. It rose and fell, carried on the air. She knew that sound. Every child of the plains knew it. A wolf was calling to its pack. Her eyes widened and she pressed her back against the tree as if she could sink into it. She had seen wolves before, but always from a safe distance, always when her people were armed and ready. Wolves were clever, hunters of the night. Alone, without a bough, without even a stone to throw, what could she do? The rope around her wrist bit deeper into her skin as she twisted, trying to loosen it, but the knots held firm. The bark of the tree scratched her arms, and she could feel the roughness of it cutting into her skin. She tried not to cry out, for she knew that sound might carry farther than she wished. The moon rose slowly, pale and cold. The land glowed under its silver light. With the moon came the sounds of the wild. She heard the rustle of something moving in the brush, then another howl, closer this time. Her breath caught in her throat. Her captors had chosen the place well, far enough from any village or camp, close enough to where beasts would prowl. The girl pressed her forehead to the tree and closed her eyes. She thought of her mother's hands weaving her hair, of her younger brother chasing a painted pony through the village, of the songs sung by the elders when the fire burned at night. The images gave her a little warmth, a reminder of home, even as fear crept into her bones. Time passed slowly. Every minute stretched like an hour. She tried to shift her feet to keep the blood moving, but even that was difficult. Her ankles had been tied as well, though not as tightly as her hands. She could move slightly, but not enough to run. She tested the ropes again, twisting and pulling, but the knots were strong. Whoever had tied her had done so with cruel skill. She was trapped. The cries of the wolves grew louder. This time she heard more than one. It was a chorus rising and falling across the plains. She knew they hunted together, moving silently until they were close enough to strike. Her eyes darted around the shadows, searching for movement. For a moment all was still. Then she saw them. Shapes moving low against the grass, gray forms slipping in and out of the moonlight. Her heart raced, but she refused to scream. If she was to face death, she would face it with dignity, as her people had taught her. The wolves circled, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark. They did not rush forward. They were patient. They tested the ground, sniffing, watching, waiting. The girl stood as tall as her bonds allowed. though her knees trembled. She whispered again in her heart, calling upon her ancestors, calling upon the strength of her people. She hoped that somehow someone would hear, perhaps a hunter from her village, perhaps even a stranger. But the plains were wide, and she was only one voice among many. The night deepened. The wind picked up, carrying with it the smell of dust and sage. The wolves drew closer, their bodies low, their tails flicking. She could hear their paws against the earth, the soft padding sound that made her skin crawl. One of them let out a short bark, and the others responded with low growls. She knew the moment was near. They would come soon. She closed her eyes again, readying herself. She thought of her father's words. Fear is the shadow. Courage is the fire. Hold the fire and you will not be lost. Her fire was small, flickering inside her, but it was still there. She breathed deeply, steadying her spirit. Her heart prayed for a miracle. Though her mind told her that none would come, still she held on. Her body pressed against the tree, her face lifted toward the stars. Above her, the sky stretched endless and vast, filled with light from countless stars that had watched over her people for generations. Perhaps they would watch over her now. Perhaps they would guide her spirit if it was her time to go. And yet deep inside she felt something else. A strange quietness, a sense that her story was not meant to end here, not tied to a tree, not in the jaws of beasts. She did not know why she felt it, but it gave her a thread of hope as thin as spider silk, yet strong enough to keep her standing. She did not know that somewhere, not too far away, a rider was moving across the plains. A cowboy, tired from travel, was making his way through the dark. His horse's hooves were steady, his eyes sharp even in the night. And though he did not yet know it, his path was about to cross hers, and his bullet would change everything. The night was deep, and the plains stretched wide under the silver light of the moon. A lone rider moved slowly across the open land, his figure outlined against the horizon. The cowboy was not a man who followed the beaten path. He lived on the edge of the wild, guided only by instinct and the steady rhythm of his horse's hooves. His name was not spoken often, for he did not stay long in one place. Towns knew him only as the quiet stranger who came and went without asking for much. He carried a rifle, a revolver, and a calm spirit shaped by long years of wandering. That night he had traveled farther than he planned. He was tired, his horse was thirsty, and he hoped to find water before stopping to rest. The land around him was silent except for the wind. He adjusted his hat against the cool air and leaned forward in the saddle, listening. Cowboys trusted their ears as much as their eyes. Out on the plains, sound often told more than sight. It was then that he heard something unusual. It was faint at first, carried on the breeze, but clear enough for him to notice. It was not the howl of a coyote, not the call of an owl. It was sharper, more desperate. It was the cry of a human voice. The cowboy slowed his horse, pulling gently on the reins. He turned his head, listening carefully. For a moment, the night returned to silence. Then he heard it again, mixed with another sound that made him straighten quickly in his saddle. Wolves. Their howls rose across the land, one voice followed by another, until the pack spoke together. He had heard many packs before. They were dangerous, especially when hunger drove them closer to people. He pressed his heels lightly into his horse's sides, urging it forward. His curiosity was strong, but so was his sense of duty. A voice in trouble was not something he could ride away from. The cowboy rode steadily, his eyes scanning the land. The moonlight gave the ground a pale glow, enough to make out shapes in the distance. He guided his horse between low bushes and patches of tall grass, careful to keep quiet. After a short time, he saw movement ahead. At first it looked like shadows sliding over the ground, but then he recognized the forms. Wolves. Their bodies were low, their eyes glowing faintly. They were circling something near a tree. He leaned forward, narrowing his eyes. His heart gave a heavy beat when he saw the figure bound against the tree. It was a girl, young and still, her arms tied back. Even from a distance he could see the ropes holding her. She was cornered, with no way to defend herself. The wolves were closing in step by step, their tails twitching as they tested the ground. The cowboy knew he had only moments. If he waited, the pack would strike. If he rode in too quickly, he might scare his horse and lose his aim. He had faced wolves before, but never under such pressure. He breathed deeply, steadying his hands. A single mistake could mean the end of her life. The girl had not seen him yet. Her eyes were fixed on the pack, her body pressed against the tree. She stood tall, though fear showed in her face. The cowboy felt a wave of respect for her courage. Many grown men would have cried out or fainted. But she faced the beasts with quiet strength. That strength gave him even more reason to act quickly. He guided his horse to a better position, lifting his rifle from its place. The metal was cold in his hands, but his grip was steady. He had been called a sharpshooter before, though he never boasted of it. To him, skill was nothing without timing. The wolves began to move closer, their paws silent on the earth. One of them let out a sharp bark and the rest seemed to respond, their bodies tightening, ready to leap. The cowboy knew the moment had come. He raised his rifle, aimed carefully, and fired. The shot echoed across the plains like thunder. A wolf at the edge of the pack fell, struck cleanly. The others froze, startled by the sudden sound. The girl's head jerked toward the noise, her eyes wide with shock. She had expected death to come from the wolves, not the voice of a gun in the night. The cowboy did not waste time. He fired again, the second shot whistling into the air. The pack scattered, some running into the grass, others snarling as they backed away. Wolves were clever. They knew when the fight was too dangerous. The cowboy lowered his rifle slightly but kept watch, his eyes following their movements. For a few tense moments the pack lingered, their glowing eyes still fixed on the prey they had nearly claimed. But the sound of the rifle and the sight of their fallen packmate were enough. Slowly they melted back into the shadows, their cries fading as they retreated into the distance. The cowboy let out a quiet breath, but he did not relax completely. Wolves sometimes returned, waiting for a chance when their enemy lowered his guard. He kept his rifle ready as he guided his horse closer to the tree. The girl was staring at him now, her body still tense, her breath uneven. He could see the fear in her eyes, but also something else: uncertainty. She did not know who he was or why he had helped her. To her, he was only a stranger with a gun, a man who had appeared from the night like a spirit of the land. He stopped a few feet away, careful not to alarm her. He swung down from his horse in one smooth motion, his boots landing softly on the ground. For a moment he stood still, letting her see him clearly. He did not speak right away. Words were not always the best way to show peace. Instead, he lowered his rifle and set it against the tree. Then he raised his hands slowly, palms open to show he meant no harm. The girl watched him closely, her eyes following every movement. The cowboy took a step forward, then another. He saw how tightly the ropes cut into her wrists, the way her arms strained against them. Her skin was raw where the bark pressed into it. He reached for the knife at his belt, pulling it free. The moonlight glinted off the blade and the girl tensed, her breath quickening. But the cowboy moved slowly, carefully holding the knife in a way that showed his purpose. He reached up, cut the first rope, then the second. The strands fell loose and the girl stumbled forward, nearly collapsing from weakness. He caught her gently, steadying her with one hand. She looked up at him, her dark eyes shining with a mixture of fear and relief. No words were spoken, for they shared no common language. But words were not needed. In that moment, both understood the truth. He had saved her life. She lifted her hands slowly, touching her wrists where the ropes had been. Then she looked back at him, nodding once. It was a small gesture, but it carried the weight of gratitude. The cowboy helped her sit on the ground, leaning her back against the tree for support. He took his water skin from the saddle and handed it to her. She drank slowly, her hands trembling. The water soothed her, giving her strength. He kept watch, his eyes scanning the shadows, ready in case the wolves returned. The night was still dangerous, and he knew they could not stay there long. But for now, the girl was safe, and that was enough. The cowboy returned to his horse, checking the saddle and gear. His mind worked quickly, planning their next move. He could not leave her alone. She needed to be returned to her people, whoever they were. He glanced back at her, seeing how she sat quietly, her eyes never leaving him. Trust was growing slowly between them. It was fragile, but it was there. He felt it, as real as the wind that moved across the plains. He had stepped into her story without meaning to, but now he could not walk away. The air was heavy with silence after the gunshots faded. The wolves had retreated into the shadows, but their cries still echoed faintly across the plains. The cowboy stood watch, his rifle steady in his hands, his eyes scanning the tall grass. He knew wolves well. They were clever hunters, quick to return if they thought the danger had passed. His horse shifted its weight nervously, ears twitching at every sound. The cowboy whispered gently to calm it, though his own body stayed tense. Beside the tree, the Comanche girl sat quietly, her knees drawn close, her eyes fixed on the man who had just saved her life. She still did not know if he was truly a friend, but something in his steady presence gave her a strange sense of safety. The night grew colder. A thin wind brushed over the land, carrying with it the smell of dust and sage. The girl shivered, her thin dress offering little warmth. The cowboy noticed and reached into his saddlebag. He pulled out a worn blanket, the kind that had kept him through countless nights under the stars. He walked toward her slowly, holding the blanket out. For a moment she hesitated, unsure if she should accept it. But then she saw the calm in his eyes, the quiet kindness in the way he offered it. She took it and wrapped it around her shoulders. The warmth of the blanket eased her trembling, and for the first time since being tied to the tree she allowed herself a small breath of relief. The wolves had not gone far. Their glowing eyes still flickered now and then at the edge of the grass. The cowboy knew it was only a matter of time before they tried again. Pax did not give up easily. He decided to keep his firepower ready. He moved a few steps away, knelt on one knee, and reloaded his rifle with practiced hands. The sound of metal clicking against metal was sharp in the still night. The girl watched him closely. She did not know his name, but she could see his skill. Every movement was smooth, without waste. This was a man who had lived long with danger, who carried it like a shadow but never let it rule him. The girl's thoughts drifted to her family. Were they searching for her even now? She pictured her father gathering the men of the village, her mother praying beside the fire, her younger brother crying out for her. The thought filled her with sadness, but also with hope. If this stranger could help her survive the night, perhaps she would see her people again. She pressed her hand against her chest as if to hold the memory of home close. Then she looked again at the cowboy, wondering why he had chosen to stop, why he had risked himself for someone he did not know. The cowboy, though quiet, felt the same question within himself. Many riders would have turned away. Trouble on the plains was common, and most men cared only for their own safety. But something had stopped him. Perhaps it was the sound of her cry, sharp with fear. Perhaps it was the sight of her courage, standing tall even as the wolves closed in. Or perhaps it was simply the truth that no decent man could leave a child of the land tied to a tree, left to die in such a cruel way. He did not know the reason, but he knew he could not ride on. His path and hers had crossed, and now their stories were bound together, at least for this night. The wolves began to circle again. Their low growls carried across the grass, rising and falling like distant drums. The girl's body tensed, and she pulled the blanket tighter. The cowboy lifted his rifle once more, his sharp eyes tracking the movement of the pack. One wolf stepped forward, bold and curious, its teeth shone white in the moonlight. The cowboy raised his weapon, but he did not fire. He knew a single shot could scatter them again, but it could also draw more danger from farther away. Gunfire traveled far on the open land. He waited, watching carefully. The wolves crept closer, their bodies weaving in and out of the shadows. The girl gasped softly, her voice caught in her throat. The cowboy glanced at her, gave a small nod, as if to say, "Stay calm." Then, with perfect timing, he fired. The shot cracked the silence, and the wolf nearest to them leapt back, its yelp splitting the air. The others scattered, growling, their eyes shining with fear. For a moment, the pack seemed ready to rush in, but then they turned, slipping into the dark once again. The cowboy lowered his rifle and let out a slow breath. He had bought them more time. The girl's hands shook, but she lifted her gaze toward him. She touched her heart and then pointed at him, a simple gesture of thanks. The cowboy understood. He gave a small nod in return, his expression calm, though his heart carried a quiet weight. He knew the danger was not over. Wolves were patient. They would circle and test again, as long as hunger drove them. He needed a plan. He glanced at the sky. The moon was high, but dawn was still hours away. The night would be long. He decided to build a fire. Fire was the one thing wolves respected, the one barrier they rarely crossed. He gathered what dry wood he could find nearby, moving quickly but carefully. The girl, though weak, tried to help, reaching for small branches within her reach. Together they built a small pile, and with his flint, the cowboy struck sparks until a flame caught. The fire grew slowly, sending light and warmth into the night. The wolves lingered at a distance, but they did not come closer. The orange glow pushed back the shadows, wrapping the two strangers in a small circle of safety. The girl leaned closer to the fire, letting its heat soothe her chilled body. She glanced at the cowboy, who sat with his rifle across his knees, his eyes never leaving the dark. The flames flickered across his face, showing lines of weariness but also strength. He was not a man of many words, she could tell, but his actions spoke clearly. He was a protector, even if only for this night. She wondered if he had a family of his own somewhere, or if the open plains were the only home he knew. Hours passed slowly. The wolves howled now and then, their cries haunting, but they kept their distance. The cowboy stayed awake, his mind alert. The girl drifted in and out of light sleep, her body exhausted. Each time she stirred, she saw him, still there, steady as the tree itself, watching over her. It gave her comfort more than she expected. Though they shared no language, no history, she trusted him now. Trust born not from words, but from action. He had come when she needed him most, and he had not left her side. When the first hint of dawn touched the horizon, the plains began to change. The cries of the wolves grew softer, fading into the distance. The sky lightened and the stars slowly disappeared. The girl opened her eyes fully, lifting her head. She saw the pale glow of morning and felt hope rise in her chest. She had survived the night. The cowboy stood and stretched his arms, his face turning toward the rising sun. He looked at her and gave a short nod as if to say, "You are safe now." She returned the nod, her lips curving into the faintest smile. The wolves were gone. The night was behind them, but the journey ahead was still unknown. The cowboy knew she needed to return to her people. And though his life was built on wandering, he also knew he could not leave her alone in the wild. As the sun climbed higher, the two strangers prepared to walk a new path together, their bond forged in the firelight and the shadows of the long night. The first rays of morning painted the plains in soft gold, chasing away the shadows of the long night. The small fire still smoldered near the base of the tree, its smoke rising gently into the sky. The Comanche girl sat close to it, wrapped in the cowboy's blanket, her eyes heavy but filled with relief. She had survived not because of luck, but because a stranger with steady hands had come at the right time. The cowboy stood a short distance away, checking his horse and tightening the saddle straps. His movements were calm, precise, like a man who had lived his whole life on the open land and trusted no detail to chance. The girl watched him carefully. She did not know his name or his story, yet something about him spoke of trust. He had not left her after cutting the ropes. He had not demanded anything from her. He had simply stayed, guarding her until the morning light returned. She felt both gratitude and wonder. Why would a stranger risk himself for someone he did not know? She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and lowered her gaze to the earth, her thoughts full of questions that had no easy answer. The cowboy turned and walked back toward her. His boots pressed lightly against the ground, his hat casting a shadow across his face. He knelt near the fire and stirred the last embers with a stick. The girl looked up at him, meeting his eyes for a brief moment. They did not share a language, but sometimes silence carried its own meaning. She gave a small nod, the simplest way she knew to say thank you. The cowboy returned the gesture with the faintest tilt of his head, then reached for his canteen. He offered it to her once more. She drank slowly, letting the cool water refresh her dry throat. When she handed it back, he pointed toward the horizon where the plains stretched far and wide. She followed his finger, then pointed in another direction, her hand trembling slightly but firm in its intent. She was trying to tell him where her people were. He studied the way she pointed, the careful way she repeated the gesture. Though they could not speak the same words, he understood. She wanted to go home. He gave a short nod, then stood tall and walked to his horse. The girl rose unsteadily to her feet. Her legs were weak from being bound so long, and the night had drained her strength. She stumbled slightly, but the cowboy reached out quickly to steady her. His grip was gentle but strong enough to keep her standing. She looked up at him, her dark eyes full of quiet determination. Though exhausted, she would walk if she had to. But the cowboy had another plan. He led his horse closer and motioned for her to climb up. At first she hesitated, unsure if she should accept such an offer. Yet the way he guided her, The way he lifted his hand as if to say, "Trust me," gave her courage. Slowly, she placed one foot in the stirrup, and with his help, she climbed onto the horse's back. The cowboy mounted behind her, his rifle resting across his lap. With a soft word to his horse, they began to move across the open land. The girl sat straight, her eyes scanning the horizon. Every hill and stream was familiar to her. She knew this land as well as her own heartbeat, and she would guide him toward her village. The cowboy, though silent, stayed alert. His eyes never stopped searching the distance. He knew danger was never far away, whether from wolves, men, or the land itself. As they traveled, the morning grew brighter. The sun warmed the earth, and the grass swayed gently in the wind. The girl pointed now and then, showing him which path to take. Sometimes she tapped his arm lightly to warn of a hidden dip in the land or a stream that crossed their way. Though they could not share words, they began to share trust. Step by step, their bond grew stronger. At midday, they stopped near a cluster of rocks where water pooled in a shallow basin. The cowboy helped her down from the horse, and she sat on the ground, resting her tired legs. He shared some dried meat from his saddlebag, and though it was plain food, she ate gratefully. Hunger had gnawed at her since the night before. As she chewed slowly, she looked at him, curious about this quiet man who had appeared from nowhere. He ate little himself, taking only what he needed. His eyes remained sharp, scanning the land even as he sat. After they rested, they continued their journey. The girl's strength returned little by little. She no longer trembled when she pointed the way. Her back was straighter, her spirit lifted by the thought of returning home. The cowboy noticed the change. He did not speak, but he felt a quiet respect for her resilience. She had faced wolves and fear, yet she carried herself with dignity. It reminded him of why he had stopped in the first place. There was something about her courage that stirred something deep within him, something he could not name. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, the land began to change. They passed over rolling hills where the grass grew thick and tall. The girl's eyes lit with recognition. She knew they were close. She pointed eagerly, her voice rising with sounds that, though he could not understand, carried the clear note of hope. The cowboy urged his horse forward, keeping pace with her directions. The closer they drew, the more the land seemed to come alive. Birds rose from the grass, and distant smoke curled upward from what might have been a fire. At last, as the evening shadows lengthened, they reached the edge of a small valley. There, in the distance, stood the girl's village. The sight filled her eyes with tears. She pressed her hand to her mouth, overwhelmed with relief. The cowboy slowed his horse, allowing her to take in the view. She turned to him, her eyes shining. She touched her heart once more and then lifted her hand toward him, a gesture of thanks far deeper than words. The cowboy gave a small nod, his face calm, but his heart touched by her gratitude. He knew his part in her story was nearly done. Soon she would be back with her people, safe and protected. Yet in that quiet moment, he felt a strange connection, as if the night they had survived together had tied an invisible thread between them. They rode slowly into the valley. As they approached the village, people rushed out, their voices rising in surprise and joy. Her family ran ahead, her mother crying out her name, her father's arms wide with relief. The girl slid from the horse and ran into their embrace, the blanket still draped around her shoulders. Tears fell freely as they held her close, their voices mixing with laughter and cries of thanks. The cowboy remained on his horse, watching quietly. He felt no need to interrupt the reunion. His place was not in the circle of family, but as the shadow who had helped guide her back. Still, when the father looked up and saw him, the man's expression shifted to one of deep gratitude. He approached the cowboy, placed a hand over his own heart, and bowed his head slightly. The gesture spoke more than words could. The cowboy tipped his hat in return, his voice silent but his meaning clear. He had only done what was right. He did not stay long in one place, and he did not seek reward. But as he turned his horse to leave, the girl broke free from her family for one last moment. She ran to him, placed her hand on his arm, and looked into his eyes. Her lips curved into a smile, soft and full of meaning. Then she stepped back, letting him go. The cowboy rode away slowly, the sound of his horse's hooves fading into the evening air. Behind him, the village celebrated the return of the girl who had been taken, the girl who had faced wolves and fear but had been saved by a single bullet and the courage of a stranger. The plain stretched before him once again, endless and quiet. The cowboy did not look back, but in his heart he carried the memory of the girl's eyes, her strength, and her gratitude. The valley was alive with voices of joy. The Comanche girl had returned, and her people gathered around her like the wind around a fire. Her mother held her close, crying tears that would not stop, while her father stood tall, pride and relief in his eyes. Children danced at the sight of her, and the elders raised their hands to the sky in thanks. The girl tried to speak, but her words were broken by sobs. She simply clung to her family, feeling their warmth, their love, and the safety of being home again. For a moment, it seemed the whole village had forgotten the troubles of the land. They had thought they had lost her forever, but she had come back, carried by fate and the courage of a stranger. The cowboy stayed at a distance, sitting quietly on his horse. He did not belong to the circle of celebration. His part in her story was almost finished, and he felt no need to push himself into the joy of a family's reunion. He watched with calm eyes, though deep inside he felt a quiet satisfaction. He had not only saved her life, but he had returned her to where she truly belonged. That was enough for him. As the sun lowered in the sky, the girl's father finally approached him. The tall man walked with the authority of a leader, his steps firm but respectful. He stopped before the cowboy, placed a hand on his own chest, and bowed his head slightly. The cowboy returned the gesture with a small nod, tipping his hat. The two men did not share words, but they understood each other. Gratitude did not always need language. The father raised his hand and motioned for the cowboy to come closer, toward the fire that was now being lit in the village center. The cowboy hesitated. He was not a man who sought company. His life had been one of long trails, empty nights, and small towns that never remembered his name. But the eyes of the people invited him, full of kindness. At last he dismounted and walked slowly into the heart of the village. The Comanche girl turned and saw him approach. She broke free from her mother's embrace and hurried toward him. She stopped just in front of him, her dark eyes glowing with happiness. She touched her heart and then pointed at him once again, the same gesture she had made by the fire in the wilderness. This time, though, her smile was brighter, filled with life and warmth. The elders welcomed him with solemn nods. A blanket was placed near the fire and food was brought out. Cornbread, roasted meat, and berries gathered from the nearby hills. The cowboy sat quietly, accepting what was given but never asking for more. Around him, the people laughed and sang, their voices rising into the night air. The girl sat with her family, but her eyes often wandered toward him, as if she wanted to make sure he was still there, as if part of her feared he might vanish like a shadow in the wind. As the fire burned brighter, stories began to flow. The people spoke of her capture, of the cruelty of those who had tied her to the tree, and of the miracle of her return. They pointed to the cowboy, their words full of respect. Though he could not understand their language, he understood their tone. He was being honored, not as an outsider, but as a man who had shown courage. He nodded politely, his face calm, though inside he felt something he had not felt for many years, a sense of belonging, even if only for one evening. The night passed with singing, dancing, and joy. The cowboy sat quietly, his rifle resting beside him, his hat tipped low. Yet in the warmth of the firelight he felt a peace that was rare for him. He had known many towns where men spoke loudly but cared little. Here the people spoke with heart. Their gratitude was deep, honest, and without condition. He found himself wondering what it might be like to stay longer, to live among them, to wake each morning to voices that welcomed him. But he quickly brushed the thought away. A man like him was made for the trail. His place was not in one home, but on the wide road where the horizon never ended. The girl, though, would not forget. She kept her eyes on him until sleep finally overcame her, and her mother led her gently into the family's lodge. Her last memory of that night was the cowboy's quiet figure sitting by the fire, his face glowing softly in the flames like a guardian who had walked out of the night only to vanish again. At dawn, the cowboy rose before the village was fully awake. He saddled his horse in silence, tightening the straps with practiced hands. He looked once toward the lodge where the girl slept, then toward the rising sun. He knew it was time to go. His life was not meant for one place. He had done what he could, and now the trail called him again. With a soft word to his horse, he mounted and began to ride slowly out of the valley. But the girl woke earlier than most. She stepped outside just as he reached the edge of the village. She saw him riding away and ran quickly, her bare feet touching the cool grass. She called out, not in words he could understand, but in a sound full of meaning. He stopped his horse and turned. She stood there, her hair loose around her shoulders, her eyes shining in the morning light. She lifted her hand, placed it over her heart, and then raised it toward him. It was her final gift of thanks. The cowboy touched the brim of his hat in reply. For a moment their eyes held, a silent promise that neither would forget. Then he turned his horse and rode on, his figure growing smaller against the endless horizon. The girl watched until he disappeared from view, her heart full of both sorrow and gratitude. She knew she might never see him again, but she also knew his name did not matter. What mattered was the courage he had given her, the life he had returned, and the bond that would live forever in her memory. The cowboy rode far into the plains, his shadow stretching long in the morning light. He did not look back, but deep inside he carried the memory of her eyes and the sound of her voice. He had saved lives before in small ways, and he would save others again. But this night, this girl, this fire, they would remain with him like a flame he could not put out. It was the kind of story he would never tell, but one that would walk beside him always in silence. The land stretched wide before him, open and wild, full of both danger and promise. The cowboy rode on, his rifle steady, his heart quiet, his spirit free. Behind him a village celebrated the return of their daughter. Ahead of him the trail waited, endless and unknown, and between them, unspoken yet eternal, lived the bond of a Comanche girl and a cowboy's bullet, the bond that had turned death into life, despair into hope, and strangers into something far more enduring.